First of all, just let me say, Happy New Year. We are now officially in the decade of 12,020. Yes, that's right, 12,020, not, 2020. I am using the Kurzgesagt, calendar proposed by the educational website, Kurzgesagt. I really don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but, that's a whole other tangent. Anyway, as the video suggests, I will be talking about the book that I was given by my aunt, known as Gunning for God, Why the New Atheists Are Missing the Mark, written by John C. Lennox. So, first of all, before I actually get into the meat of what I really wanted to talk about in regards to the book, I need to establish first the fact that this video is not really going to be the same style and context as the video response I did for Worry Less, Pray More, for several reasons that I'm going to get into. The video I made on Worry Less, Pray More was very much so a one-sided formal refutation of the overall claims presented in the book, but this video is more just going to be a summary/review/general thoughts given. The first thing I'm going to do is give a summary of the book and each of its chapters, and, that's due to the fact that, unlike Worry Less, Pray More, you haven't actually read this one when you gave it to me as a Christmas present, So anyway, starting off, the author, John C. Lennox, is a British mathematician, as well as a Christian apologist, and the reason he wrote the book, as he tells in his introduction, is because of the fact that he sees the new atheist movement, spearheaded by atheist activists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, as rapidly developing into its own, and he definitely has a point to what he's saying. The percentage of openly non-religious has been growing pretty rapidly in the past few decades, at least in the Western world. I mean, I myself am a representative of that shift in demographics. However, John C. Lennox sees this as a negative thing and is very critical of both the claims of new atheists and how they go about representing them. A lot of the book is dedicated to talking about and subsequently refuting claims that are put forth by atheists previously listed in their books. Like, for example, Lennox talks about The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Grand Design by Stephen Hawking, God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, Breaking the Spell by Daniel Dennett, The End of Faith, The Moral Landscape, and The Letter to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris, and In Defense of Atheism by Michael Onfray. In all honesty, I don't really know much about these atheists, and I definitely haven't read their books, so I can't really make an accurate judgment of how well Lennox handled their arguments, or if he was just misrepresenting them by, taking quotes out of context. Back to the actual summary, though, the first chapter is titled, Are God and Faith Enemies of Reason and Science? This chapter is basically meant to address the claim made by atheists that, belief in God is illogical and contradictory to the methodology of science. So the chapter basically attempts to use rational arguments relating to scientific evidence to try to argue for God's existence. The second chapter is titled, Is Religion Poisonous? This chapter basically deals with the real-world implications of religion, attempting to address the claim made by many atheists that religious belief is incredibly harmful to the world. The chapter presents a look at some of the negative effects that religion can have in some cases, and tries to examine those effects, as well as presenting the many good effects that religion, particularly Christianity, has had and still has on the world. The third chapter is called Is Atheism Poisonous? This chapter essentially tries to debunk the claim made by many atheists that a lack of a belief in God never harmed anyone. It looks a lot at the horrible things that the 20th century atheist dictators enacted and how atheism may have played a part, and expresses concern in the obliviousness of modern atheists dismissing those claims. So the fourth chapter is called Can We Be Good Without God? This chapter essentially tries to undermine the atheist claim that God and the Bible are not at all necessary or helpful in determining morality. The chapter also levies heavy criticism against the claim that science can be used to inform moral values. The fifth chapter is called Is the God of the Bible a Despot? The chapter determines to answer the very common claim made by many atheists that Jehovah, as portrayed in the Old Testament, is a mass-murdering psychopathic dictator. The chapter addresses many of the morally questionable actions commanded by God in the Old Testament, and then later makes the case that it's beneficial to have some form of authority over ourselves to mediate our actions. The sixth chapter is called Is Atonement Morally Repellent? The chapter is basically a response to the atheist claim that the resurrection narrative of Jesus Christ doesn't make any sense and is not morally fair or just. It offers a defense of the sacrifice of Jesus and points out how it was necessary to save all of us from the very real problem of sin. The seventh chapter is called Are Miracles Pure Fantasy? The chapter is a response to the claim some atheists make that miracles are a logical impossibility and defy the laws of nature. The chapter encourages a healthy sense of skepticism when looking at miracle claims, but argues that the existence of miracles is certainly not impossible and is completely coherent with the idea of God existing. The eighth chapter is titled, Did Jesus Christ Rise from the Dead? The final chapter attempts to deal with the atheist claim that there is not enough historical evidence to make a good case for the resurrection of Jesus. The chapter is quite critical of those who make claims about history without actually studying it vigorously, and goes over the historical evidence present and tries to reconstruct a logically consistent resurrection narrative. At the end of the book, in the final section, Lennox offers his conclusions to his findings, determining that God clearly and unmistakably reveals himself to human beings through moral conscience, written revelation, and his magnificent creation. And he makes the claim that atheism is a nihilistic position deprived of hope, offering no legitimate answers, while Christianity offers a reason to live for the resurrection of Jesus. So, overall, what did I think of this book? I enjoyed it, and to be honest, I didn't really think I would. I was honestly kind of dismissive at first, because in the introduction, Lennox says some stuff that's kind of dumb, like, atheist enemy is God, and they want to kill him, which is untrue, and he appeals to Pascal's wager, which is a really bad argument, and he talks about how atheists are rude and too aggressive, which was kind of a turnoff, but the book isn't just a bunch of debunked arguments and slander that I've heard before. It actually goes pretty into depth and into some complicated topics. This book, I wouldn't say is directed at the religious. I think it was definitely made to convince people like me to question what they believe, and because of that, I think it's a lot more interesting to me than a book for the religious. The author John Lennox is also a really smart guy, and he definitely knows a lot about math, science, philosophy, history, theology, and psychology, or at least he did a lot of research in making this book. I mean, one of the biggest issues that I had with Theology of the Body for Beginners and Worry Less, Pray More were that they were completely unsubstantiated in regards to actual experts. But, if you look in the back of the book, Lennox did a lot of research, citing a ton of books and researching philosophers and watching a ton of religious debates and consulting historians. Stuff he talks about in the book having to do with astrophysics, existentialism, and string theory are definitely not simple concepts to understand. And since I'm not exactly an expert in any of these things, and am, 17, I'm not exactly going to try to refute them, but safe to say I certainly found the stuff Lennox was talking about to be very interesting, and it did really get me to think. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I thought the book was, I thought it was very... Big Ray! I also like how, rather than just focusing on one topic like Worry Less, Pray More did, Gunning for God covers a wide range of topics from in the ongoing debate, and as I said before, Lennox pretty much spends each chapter going into depth and trying to meticulously answer different hang-ups that atheists have about Christianity. As I said before, I'm certainly not an expert, but I am somewhat knowledgeable about a lot of the stuff that Lennox was talking about, and from what I could see, he was pretty accurate with his information. Like, for example, he pointed out very real phenomenons, like atheists typically having significantly lower birth rates than religious people, and he pointed out the study that found that people are more scrupulous when they feel like they're being watched, and he even included the little detail of how, of the Ten Commandments, all of them except for the fourth commandment are backed up in the New Testament. So, yeah, I found him to be pretty credible with his information. I mean, do I necessarily agree with him? Yeah, well, let's look at the chapters. The first chapter, as stated before, is about Lennox arguing that it is not at all irrational for scientists to believe in God. This chapter is pretty good, and I absolutely agree with him on the fact that it's not irrational to believe in a God. I am completely open to the possibility of a God that created the universe, even if I don't believe in that myself. But I don't really have a problem with deism, and I think it's a perfectly acceptable philosophical position to take after. And in all fairness, Lennox is able to argue pretty strongly for it, and he uses a lot of scientific understandings about the universe to make his case, which I don't know nearly enough about, stuff like astrophysics and other scientific branches to try to refute. The problem I always have, though, is when people try to argue that there is a God that created the universe, is that they're almost never arguing for a God, but rather a specific God, and in this case, Jehovah. And that's usually where arguments to try to connect the concept of the creator of the universe to the concept of the creator of the universe who also tried to physically wrestle a guy and lost tend to fall a little flat. Lennox also talked a lot about the terminology of words, like he went over how words like faith, evidence, belief, and logic are sometimes thrown around by people, and he basically tried to establish them as defined terms, which, I appreciated. Lennox also makes mention of how many of the greatest minds in history and still today have been believers in Christianity, and that there have been many cases of atheists actually impeding scientific progress, like how some atheist scientists rejected the Big Bang Theory because it gave evidence of a creation event. To be fair, one of the things I like about this book is that it's not totally biased, and Lennox does take time to acknowledge some of the very harmful actions taken by Christians and other theists, and in this chapter he does make mention of how religious motivation can sometimes impede scientific progress. However, Lennox argues that while there are many intolerant Christians who will ignore all the facts and stick to their dogmatic beliefs, atheists are actually more intolerant, and even though they always talk about evidence and being unbiased, they are actually even more dismissive of religious arguments. And to be honest, I think there is some truth to that. What originally pulled me to the atheist community was the very intelligent and evidence-based approach people took to expressing their arguments. But even after following the atheist community for only 7 months now, I can clearly see that that's not the case for every atheist. And there are definitely many atheists who are not skeptical towards some of the things that they believe. I think in many ways, people who are atheists are given a certain boost of confidence where they think, well, I figured this thing out for myself, and so I'm smarter than all those religious people with their ridiculous beliefs. And so they can become very arrogant and dogmatic. I mean, this to some extent was the case with me. I mean, I certainly felt a lot more confident in my positions after I became an atheist. It's a very easy trap to fall into, and I think it's also really common in a lot of religious people as well, where they think well, because I have this relationship with God, the Almighty Father, I know more than all these other non-believers. Here's the thing, though. While that is a phenomenon that does take hold of some atheists and is a dangerous thing to watch out for, Christians are so much more guilty of this than atheists. I have experienced the word of many Christians online and in real life, and they're usually not very subtle about how incredibly unskeptical they are. Whenever I see Christians trying to refute atheism, they always use incredibly flimsy, non-scientific, and ridiculous arguments like, well, you can't answer my question, therefore God exists. What if you're wrong? There are no atheists in foxholes. I just feel in my heart that God is real. I prayed for something, and the prayer came true, therefore God exists. God works in mysterious ways. Satan is the Lord of lies, and he is deceiving you. And, well, we had to come from somewhere, therefore God must have created us. I mean, in terms of intellectual honesty, you'd be hard-pressed to find an atheist who is 100% certain that God doesn't exist, but I gotta say it is not so the other way around. On top of that, while there certainly have been and still are many skeptical and scientific Christians, they didn't actually get scientific education or inspiration from the Bible because there's absolutely nothing scientific about the book. And in fact, the Bible defines wisdom as blind loyalty to God without any doubts whatsoever, which is the exact opposite of wisdom. On top of that, though, Lennox tries to claim that Christianity isn't really about pushing religious beliefs onto children, and states that his own parents allowed him to think for himself and decide what he wanted to believe. And yeah, great for him, but that is a very uncommon Christian childhood, and it is standard Christian practice to raise your child to believe what you've been taught about God from birth. In fact, it is written in the very doctrine of Christianity, as the New Testament states that Christians must bring up their children to believe in the faith, and Christians must reject all other teachings of the world that are contrary to those of the gospel. I mean, I was a recipient of this indoctrination and was raised my entire childhood to believe in the Word of God as absolute truth, as is Catholic social doctrine. My point is that it's not the atheists who are denying evolution and climate change and trying to stifle sexual education in the United States. It's the Christians. I mean, for crying out loud, a few weeks ago I was watching an atheist video, that supported an atheist video, and a Christian advertising site decided to put this in front of the video to try to sway some people. Let's watch it.
Not the science, not the research that may support my viewpoint or my experience, but what does the Word of God say? You have to play mental and interpretive gymnastics with the Bible in order to get it to say something you want it to say rather than what it says. I believe the Bible is truth with a capital T. that God has spoken, and He has spoken to every issue. And if you believe the Bible, then all scientific research on any subject, all medical and psychological data, all human opinion must be subject to the authority of the living Word of God.
In the end, though, as I said before, I did enjoy the chapter and thought it made some good points, even though I think Lennox's blaming of atheists for acting more dogmatic than Christians is completely wrong. Before I get into the next few chapters, though, I just wanted to actually point out a pretty good point I think Lennox made, which is that just like how atheists accuse Christians of believing in God just because they want to and can't handle the truth of there being no afterlife, many atheists also greatly find the idea of there being no God to judge them after they die very comforting. And, I think that's largely true. Many atheists, including myself, can attest to the fact that, belief in and fear of God made us miserable, and we were relieved when we came to the conclusion that the Bible was almost certainly false. Just something I found interesting and insightful in the chapter. Anyway, the next chapter, as I said before, tries to refute the claim that religion, at least Christianity, has had a net negative effect on the world, and I honestly like this chapter, and I think Lennox made a lot of good points. While I am definitely no Stefan Molyneux fanboying over Christianity, I don't deny the fact that it has done a lot of good for a lot of people, like inspiring people to build homes and shelters for the poor, and helping people find security and hope in their faith. And while I don't think it's a very reliable or humane system, I admit that yes, making people believe that they will be judged in the afterlife can sometimes act to discourage bad behavior. Sometimes. Lennox also makes clear the very true fact that while some atheists may claim that Christianity is as bad as, say, Islam, that notion is, simply false. As well, Christian-motivated violence did and still does take place. There aren't dangerous Christian terrorist associations threatening the peace and security of citizens like there are Islamic ones. And yeah, that's true. While there are obviously a lot of similarities between different religions and how they operate, you wouldn't, for example, say that Buddhism, which teaches that there is no soul, is the same as Christianity, which places heavy emphasis on the soul. So yeah, I think Lennox made a lot of good points in the chapter, but what I think he might not be understanding is that he blames atheists for their complete lack of nuance and rejection of his points. But while that is certainly the case with some atheists to varying degrees, from what I found, a lot of atheists aren't just dismissive of the points that Lennox made. While American atheists, yes, they do tend to criticize Christianity more than Islam, that's just because they live in a majority Christian country. And most atheists don't actually think that, Christianity possesses the same threat level that Islam does.
At present, the most powerful theocracies in the world are Islamic. The countries most dominated by conservative religious ideology are countries with Muslim majorities. Islam is undeniably massively impactful in a way that no other religion, including Christianity, has enjoyed for at least a couple hundred years. It's in total control of massive governments, dominates political discourse for hundreds of millions, and is still growing faster than any other religion. The alternative to appearing to single it out by criticizing it in particular is letting one of the most influential socio-political phenomenons of our time go unchecked. Even if one argues that Christianity still has more adherents and more influence on the most powerful, wealthy countries in the world, one still has to acknowledge that those countries also have controls against the kind of religious domination we see in the Muslim world. There are those who desperately want Christian theocracy, but those people are constantly criticized rightly by religious moderates and non-religious people alike.
On top of that, while again there are many atheists who claim that Christianity never did anything good, there are a lot that I have seen that completely admit to when religion does teach good values, and when the church can be a source of aid for many people. Many in the official atheist community are aware of the power and influence that religion has, and are in complete awareness of the limitations of atheism to provide a genuine sense of community and pro-social values among non-believers. And the thing is, many atheist activists are actually trying to take after the work of churches and trying to improve the atheist community for its members.
I'm not saying we should copy the church. Believe me, there are lots of things we don't want to do, just like them. But we also have the luxury of knowing what they do that we really hate, and we can avoid all that. We can learn a lot from Christian churches, from what they do well, about how to get our own message across. And maybe if we, followed some of these pastors, we could actually do ourselves a favor.
Lennox also makes clear that whenever Christians have killed other people in order to proselytize using fear tactics, these actions were completely contrary to the words of Jesus, who spread a message of nonviolence, and he criticizes atheists for saying that Christianity is a violent religion, when its central figure was not violent at all. Again, this is very true, and as someone with a strong conviction towards nonviolence, I can absolutely respect the New Testament for not ever advocating for violent conversion tactics. But again, I haven't really seen any atheist who actually believes that it does, because most atheist activists like myself have actually read the Bible and know it pretty well, and it's pretty clear to anyone who has read it that Jesus advocates for nonviolent resistance in all cases during his lifetime. Whenever atheists criticize Christianity for inciting violence, they are pretty much always referring to the Old Testament, which is an official part of Christianity and is extremely violent. But I find Lennox's preoccupation with violence interesting, because he seems to be under the impression that that is the only way to judge whether a belief system is harmful or not. But when you see people criticizing Christianity, it's usually not because they say it's too violent, but that it promotes discrimination against gay people, against atheists, and it indoctrinates children with the fear of hell at a young age, and it's a sexist religion, which, while of course not true of all people in all churches, are still, major problems, and these things are not at all absent from the New Testament.
Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as it is fit in the Lord. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence.
Stuff like that, which many Christians still take to heart to this day, are often what you would hear atheists criticizing about Christianity. But on top of that, remember how before I was agreeing with Lennox about how Christianity was significantly less harmful than Islam? Well, I meant that more referring to a sense of practical application than actual dogma, because, well, okay, so let me put it to you this way. So I've been reading the Quran lately, and I really have to say that all those horrible, crazy things you hear Islamic extremists doing are absolutely backed up in their holy book. Like, for example, the Quran states that women who touch their other men's testicles have to have their hands chopped off, and if a man rapes a virgin, then he only needs to pay her father a sum of money to get her father's blessing for marriage, and homosexuals, adulterers, and those who worship other gods must be put to death, and children who disrespect their parents deserve to be stoned. Yeah, I know, it's pretty horrible stuff, right? Well, so here's the thing. I lied, and I've never actually read the Quran. Those horrible commandments that I just listed came from the Old Testament of the Holy Bible. Now, most Christians don't, follow any of those laws, and that's exactly what Richard Dawkins meant when he said that moral people don't actually give any attention to what the Bible says. But just because those commandments given in the Old Testament do not inspire that many people to carry them out, that doesn't mean that they cannot and should not be criticized, especially when they are in a book that people claim is all good and infallible.
Because we recognize that this piece of art is a reflection of the culture that made it, and because the opinions expressed by it are still present in modern society, that we say this art is harmful. It's not all about what happens on the surface level.
Overall, though, I disagree with the conclusions made by Lennox, but I still enjoyed the chapter and agreed with a lot of his points. So Chapter 3 is dedicated to Lennox throwing the atheist critique of religion, making the world a worse place to live in, back onto atheism. So the chapter basically tries to show how atheism has been responsible for more deaths and suffering than religion has, especially in the 20th century. Now, I was incredibly skeptical of this chapter when I was first going to read it, because it's just such a common claim that Christians make when they want to insult atheists. Oh, atheist regimes under Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot were responsible for the deaths of millions of people. Atheism is so immoral. Again, I would usually answer this by saying that, Nazi Germany and Italy under Mussolini, which also killed millions of people, had overwhelmingly Christian majority populations, but this chapter honestly made what I think are some pretty good points. See, I used to be under the impression, Richard Dawkins, as Lennox quotes from, that not believing in God cannot actually, inspire violence or oppression, and to a certain extent, I still believe that on its own it can't, but this chapter really made me realize that rationalization and, Enlightenment thinking, which have been, historically tied with atheism, haven't inspired totally benevolent ideals. I mean, I think that sometimes atheists tend to put too little emphasis on a lot of the horrors of state atheist regimes of the 20th century. And it was really interesting for me in this chapter to learn more about the horrible acts committed against various religious institutions. I consider myself a scientifically minded rationalist, and, I place the values of scientific progress on a very high pedestal. But this chapter really introduced a lot of questions for me to ponder about that. Now, obviously the reason so many people were killed in the 20th century wasn't simply due to new rationalist values, but as pointed out by pretty much every single historian, it was because of technology that had become available that made it possible to carry out the mass killing techniques. But, that's the thing. Those technological advances were brought about through science, and I think a lot of people, myself included, can sometimes be caught up in the idea that, progress and scientific advancements are always good because, well, just look at the incredible world we live in. It is the way it is because of, technological progress and scientific advancement. But, there are two sides to every coin, and in addition to producing life-saving medicines and connecting the world through the internet and transportation methods like cars and planes, science has also produced, mustard gas, machine guns, and nuclear weapons capable of destroying the entire world. As Lennox says, science is inherently amoral and is simply a process to try to understand the natural world. And even though it can be useful in determining morality, like, for example, scientific research can prove that different races are not superior to others and that homosexuals don't have a mental disorder, in and of itself, science cannot really create morality. It really can be either a positive or a very negative force. Overall, I would say that I really liked Chapter 3, and it gave me a lot of hard things to really ponder. Speaking of which, we're already in Chapter 4, and Chapter 4 is a natural extension of Chapter 3, where Lennox talks about having morality in a world without God. Basically, he quotes Fyodor Dostoevsky saying that if there is no God, then everything is permissible, and states how atheism cannot actually inform any moral values. And to be honest, at least on his point of atheism not informing any moral values, that's definitely true. Disbelief in God, just like science, is inherently amoral. Lennox also talks about how not only can you not have objective moral values if there is no God, but there's also no reason to hold subjective moral values either in that kind of world. This chapter was okay. A lot of his arguments for morality have kind of already been debunked by others better than I can do, but I will say that just like through the entire book, Lennox is very good at displaying his points, and while I don't think he necessarily comes to sound conclusions in this chapter, his discussions of free will and human duty in the face of a naturalistic universe where humans are the product of genetic material are fascinating, and they did raise a lot of important questions. What I think here is that Lennox didn't exactly take into account the fact that even if you believe in a God, that doesn't necessarily give you any moral standards to live by. That would be like saying, I believe that there are intelligent aliens out there in the universe. Unless those aliens actually handed down a moral standard for the inhabitants of Earth to follow, then the existence of those aliens would have no bearing on our lives whatsoever. Of course, Christians and many other religions claim that this is not the case, and God doesn't just exist. He really did hand down a moral standard for his people to follow. Now, someone like me would obviously refute this. I don't believe that God ever handed a moral standard down for humanity to follow, and all the religions that claim their morality came from God are really just subjective moral systems created by humans, as evidenced by their many flaws. The thing is, aside from some of the more harmful things that Christianity teaches as listed above, one of the main problems I have with Christianity as a moral system is how arbitrary a lot of its commands are. Like, okay, for example, I learned in Catholic school that it's immoral to intentionally miss Sunday Mass. Now, why is that? It's not harming me, it's not harming the people at the church, so why shouldn't I be able to just stay at home or go to work? Well, there's no reason except because it makes God sad or something.
Smile, dude. Don't be so dour. You're the creator of the universe. What the fuck you got to be sad about?
Actually, in regards to that short clip I just played, I do real quick just want to interject, though, and diverge from the chapter discussions for a minute and talk about something that I was noticing when I was reading the book. So John Lennox often makes the criticism throughout that atheists are rude and often resort to disrespectful mockery tactics that don't amount to any kind of legitimate argument. This relates to how many religious people commonly label atheists as being disrespectful to other people's beliefs, and yeah, in many cases that's true, but what's the actual problem with that in the first place? I mean, atheists who are critical of religion are obviously going to have a lack of respect for it, and while no, mockery is not a legitimate argument, there is no doubt that comedy, especially controversial comedy, is an incredibly useful tool for helping people recognize flaws in something that they hadn't before. So as long as personal attacks towards individuals are not being performed, mockeries such as this.
For 20 points, to provide a dowry for his marriage to Saul's daughter Michal, the Lord was with David as he went into battle and sliced off the fleshy tips of how many Philistine penises? 200. Ding, 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 ding. Correct! I'm sorry, a wedding dowry of foreskins? Wow.
Or at least in my opinion, completely acceptable and warranted in criticism of anything, really. The irony is that in the book, Lennox criticizes political correctness, saying how being polite and trying not to offend other people doesn't actually help anything, and is a negative quality in our society, which I totally agree with. But the thing is, in terms of religious debate and discussion, from what I have witnessed, it's most often Christians who react very dramatically to things that they consider offensive, which is not difficult to understand due to the fact that etched deep into Christianity are the principles that God the Almighty Father is not to be mocked, criticized, or blasphemed in any way. But the right to offend is one of the most important rights a person can possibly have, because without it there cannot truly be free speech. No one would really have objection to creating political cartoons, making fun of certain political candidates or parties, for example. So why exactly is something like this forbidden as a sin in Christianity? Anyway, tangent over. Back to what I was talking about before, that while religious morality systems like Christianity intend to be helpful to human beings, which is a good thing, they also put a lot of emphasis on appeasing God, which doesn't really seem to help human beings, and in fact can in many ways harm them. The fact is that there are thousands of morality systems that have been proposed throughout history, and all of them have been subjective, by man, and for man, including Christianity. And yeah, a lot of them are pretty bad, but that goes completely against the idea that Christianity is the only way you can have morality. Humans have been creating different forms of it since before the first Jewish scriptures were ever written down. But if I were to judge which morality system is most beneficial to humans and human society, I would definitely have to pick the morality system of humanism.
What is humanism? It is a philosophy and a life stance. Humanists assert that humans must be responsible for making their own lives better. It is about creating a kinder, gentler society through the spirit of compassion, reason, and critical thinking. As humanists, we do not rely on gods or angels for help. We take it upon ourselves to make the world a better place. All people are born with the capacity to do good. Our empathy, our compassion, and our selflessness has emerged within us over millions of years through the process of evolution. This capacity to love has made us stronger, not weaker. It has helped us form stronger communities and brought us happiness and courage in our darkest hours. However, most of us do not realize this. We often attribute our good qualities to religious, political, or racial labels. This is divisive and unnecessary. As humans, all of us are capable of doing good just for goodness sake. The world's most pressing problems should be solved through human thinking and action, instead of hoping for divine intervention.
Humanism is honestly a really good philosophy to take after because it puts ultimate value on human freedom and the dignity of the human person, which is inviolable by any imaginary or real deity. And I find it kind of suspect that while mentioning it a few times, Lennox never actually brings humanism into this discussion about morality, instead implying that Christianity is king. I can't really see any actual flaws in the philosophy of humanism, at least as a general guide to living with other people, and thus far none have been legitimately pointed out to me, and this is why I think there is a big problem with Lennox's conclusions. See, Lennox states that if atheism continues to spread and gain prominence the way that it is now, then there's a possibility that rationalistic and naturalistic values that played a part in the horrific abominations carried out in the 20th century have the potential to surface and bear fruit again. And while I think that it is absolutely valuable to look at history and try to make sure such horrible events don't repeat themselves, I really don't think that kind of thing will actually happen again. That's because from what I have seen, the philosophy of humanism is overwhelmingly popular among atheist activists, and the humanist society has extremely strong ties with the atheist community. I kind of find it interesting how all throughout the book, Lennox describes the atheists of the 21st century as new atheists, which is honestly a term I had barely heard of before reading the book. But maybe what makes these atheists of the 21st century new isn't the fact that they are just more vocal and aggressive than those of the past decades, but the fact that they hold very different values than those of state atheist regimes that came before. Not only is the atheist community dedicated to skepticism, scientific advancement, and the delegitimization of religion, but also freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom to insult, and freedom to love.
Don't get me wrong, you're still going to have a congregation after all of this. You're still going to be able to preach this nonsense for the remainder of your life. But I take great pride and joy in knowing that the only way there is going to be a chance of you being remembered, it will be as one of the great perpetuators of a terrible belief, and you would be remembered as a hateful bigot. Your doctrine of homophobia will not win because it's already lost. Things aren't perfect and there's a long way to go, but the progress we are making is incredible. It is fast and it will forget your fucking ass.
The 5th chapter is where I started to have some major problems. As I said before, the chapter attempts to deal with the pretty much universal complaint among atheists, including myself, that the Old Testament is filled to the brim with horrible, barbaric violence carried out by God as well as the people in the name of God. And when I was about to read it, I was thinking to myself, there is no way that this guy can possibly justify the events of the Old Testament. And, yeah, I don't really think he did. I mean, he does at least admit that some of the actions and commands in the Old Testament might be questionable, but he still falls into the trap of trying to defend some of the actions taken, and using arguments for why the wars waged were not as bad as they might seem, and even claiming that the wars carried out by Israel were actually more just than any of the other nations at the time. I found most of his arguments in this section to be really bad. Like, he tries to explain that when the Old Testament says that the Israelites slaughtered every single inhabitant of a city, that couldn't possibly have been the case because the city appears later in the Bible. Okay, first of all, that's what you call a plot hole. There's tons of them in the Bible. And secondly, though Lennox seems to know a lot about the Bible, I don't think he realizes how unreliable Old Testament stories are. I mean, they're basically just fictional propaganda stories that have been repeatedly debunked by historians. What I find to be one of Lennox's most, laughable defenses of the Old Testament, though, is when he implies that events such as the Israelite slaughter of the Canaanites were exceptional instances, and they were not very common occurrences. What?
Tell Josh to kill every single person in the following cities: Jerusalem, Ai, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, Eglon, Gezer, Debir, Geder, Hormah, Arad, Libnah, Adullam, Makeda, Bethel, Tapua, Hefer, Apek, Lasharon, Madan, Hazor, Shimron, Murdan, Akshapah, Tanakh, Megiddo, Kadesh, Jokneam, and Carmel, Dor, Goyim, and Tirzah.
God, that's a lot of fucking cities.
And that was just one chapter of one book of the Old Testament. The Old Testament of the Bible is incredibly violent, and while, yes, some of that violence is committed upon the Israelites, most often violence is carried out by the Israelites on other nations in the name of God with his specific command or allowance. Sure, there have been times where God has told the Israelites not to attack other nations, but in those instances, it was almost always because of reprimands for the Israelites disobeying him, or because of some kind of covenant made with another nation. The Old Testament makes it very clear that God's plan is to have the Israelites slaughter and subjugate all the other peoples of the land, and to kill all those who worship other gods. I am honestly really sick of people trying to justify the violence of the Old Testament. And there were a lot of things that Lennox didn't really cover in his chapter, instead focusing on a few specific examples, most likely attempting to shift attention away from the hundreds of pages of brutality that exists. He ends the chapter talking about how it is actually a good thing that God is watching over all of us, and will judge us in the end, which I will certainly have some things to say about later, but yeah, this chapter really didn't do anything for me, and I found it to be pretty flimsy. Okay, so the 6th chapter, as I said before, tries to explain the death of Jesus on the cross was necessary to save us from our sins, and he basically tries to justify it by pointing out that, no, humans are not guiltless beings and do a lot of bad things, so our sins can't simply be let go without consequence, and Lennox defends Jesus' sacrifice as incredibly heroic and a supremely divine act to save all of us. I'm of course oversimplifying. Lennox goes into a lot more detail, and because of the fact that this video is getting kind of long already, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this chapter. In summary, I thought the chapter was okay. Lennox made some good points and had a pretty good way of explaining what his position was, but I think in the end his argument kind of fell flat, and he didn't really answer a lot of the main complaints I've heard other atheists give about the resurrection narrative. Like, for example, he doesn't really talk about how Christ's sacrifice wasn't actually a sacrifice at all, since, he didn't actually stay dead. Alright, so basically the 7th chapter tries to debunk the claim some atheists make that miracles are impossible, and honestly I like this chapter. I think Lennox gave a pretty fair assessment in his arguments. unlike a lot of Christians, he didn't try to make the claim that, miracles were happening all around us, and he didn't try to attribute a bunch of events that have plausible naturalistic explanations to divine inspiration. Instead, he only really tried to defend the miracles that are present in the New Testament of the Bible, particularly the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which was pretty refreshing. He definitely encourages skepticism when trying to determine whether or not something is a miracle. In fact, he actually endorsed a quote from Francis Collins, which basically makes the same case I did when I made my previous video essay on Worry Less, Pray More. Quote, "It is crucial that a healthy skepticism be applied when interpreting potentially miraculous events, lest the integrity and rationality of the religious perspective be brought into question. The only thing that will kill the possibilities of miracles more quickly than a committed materialism is the claiming of miracle status for everyday events which natural explanations are readily at hand." Yeah, I like that quote. Anyway, Lennox's arguments for why miracles are possible is also pretty consistent, and I honestly agreed with it. I don't really hold the position of some atheists who believe that miracles, at least as they are defined by Lennox, are impossible. I simply don't believe that they can take place due to a lack of evidence, though. But certainly, as Lennox claims, if an all-powerful God created the universe did exist, then he would be absolutely capable of interacting with it and manipulating the laws and materials he was responsible for creating to, say, for instance, restructure the protons, neutrons, and electrons in H2O to create wine. Though, if you ask me, that does kind of seem to be a pretty underwhelming use of his power. But overall, yeah, I thought that Lennox's argument, touching upon the principle of, uniformity of experience was pretty solid. Alright then, now we get to the final chapter, where Lennox tries to use historical documents as well as the accounts of the four Gospels and the other New Testament sources to try to argue for the existence of the divinity of Jesus. I like this chapter. I need to be upfront and say that while I've obviously read the New Testament and done some studies on the historicity of it, I'm certainly not an expert, so I'm not going to try to totally debunk what Lennox says or anything like that. Overall, though, I thought he was detailed in his analysis and implemented a lot of historical data and opinions from different historians. Perhaps a little too much detail, though, because the chapter was a little too long, and in my opinion, it had too much of an overemphasis in painstakingly recreating the resurrection narrative, which was impressive, and I know that's what Lennox was intentionally trying to emphasize, but I think it took a bit of time away from addressing some of the complaints that many atheists have about the historical accuracy of the Bible. For instance, Lennox doesn't really have a refutation of the fact that the Gospels had an obvious intention in mind to influence their readers, and many of the events that could have been easily fictionalized or exaggerated, and he treats the Gospel of Luke like a historical narrative when it's obviously not. I mean, the Gospels definitely seem to have some relation to actual events, but I'm not claiming, like some atheists, that Jesus didn't actually exist at all. But it's clear to anyone who reads the Gospels that the Gospels are not history books. They are stories, and they read like stories. They give you insight into the characters' specific emotions and detailed conversations and events that could not possibly have been eyewitness testimony. For example, like Jesus praying to God alone in the Garden of Gethsemane. He also doesn't really mention how large sections of Luke and Matthew are basically just copied from the Gospel of Mark, and he doesn't spend too much time talking about the fact that the first writings of Jesus ever recorded were written 20 years after his apparent death. And if you know anything about human memory or the whisper down the lane phenomenon, that doesn't exactly boast all that well for the Gospel's overall accuracy.
The Gospels were written decades later with an obvious agenda intent on depicting Jesus as the new David, the new Moses, a king, a Messiah, or a God. My suspicion is if you found someone whom you think might be the Jesus you're looking for, then other time travelers or archaeologists or historians would likely say that it was someone else, or that parts of this legend pertain to someone else. And if you let that guy see any version of Christianity, even a century later, he wouldn't recognize it and wouldn't even think the story was about him.
In the final reflection section of the book, Lennox talks about how, even though he did a bunch of research and made a bunch of complicated arguments for God's existence, knowledge of God is available to everyone and not just for enlightened thinkers. He also cranks up his criticism of atheism to 11 and quotes the first chapter of Romans, which states how atheists really know that God exists because his invisible qualities are present to everyone and they just deny his existence. And that's pretty clearly untrue. I mean, while there may be dogmatic atheists who just reject all arguments opposing their viewpoints, that's not true for all of them. It's not even the majority, and it's certainly not true for me. What Lennox and other Christians can't seem to wrap their minds around is how myself and other non-believers can look at reality and just not see intention in it. But the fact is that different types of people have different ways of thinking and take different things away from evidence. And while Lennox may see the evidence of God as somehow obvious, that doesn't mean that it is, and it doesn't mean that everyone else will agree with him. Atheists are not just foolish people denying evidence, at least not most of them, and I really don't think it's a coincidence that the more humans have come to learn about the natural world, the more secular our societies and our sciences have become. If the existence of God was so obvious, then there would be overwhelming scientific consensus for it, but there isn't. However, many atheists like myself don't expressly deny the possibility of the existence of God. We just don't feel the arguments for his existence are strong enough or consistent enough to build our position upon them. However, then you have people like John Lennox telling us that we need to order the sum of our lives and behavior around not just a deity, but a specific deity that demands constant praise and worship, made a donkey talk, and sacrificed himself unto himself to appease himself. So, excuse me if I can't get behind that thinking. Alright, so, anyway, in the last paragraph of the book, Lennox uses an appeal to emotion, saying, quote, "Atheism has no answer to death, no ultimate hope to give. It is an empty and sterile worldview, which leaves us in a closed universe that will ultimately incinerate any last trace that we ever existed. It is quite literally a hopeless philosophy. Its story ends in the grave." This kind of thinking has pretty much been debunked pretty succinctly by many atheists, but to sum up why this quote doesn't really make sense, it's because Lennox and many other Christians seem to think that the only way we can matter is if we live for eternity, and have the intention of the omnipotent creator of the universe in mind, but this is just wrong and arrogant. We will all eventually die one day, as will our species, and very likely the entire universe, but right now we matter to each other. You matter to me, I matter to you, and past generations matter to us, and we will matter to future generations. And that mattering doesn't need to be recognized by the most powerful being in the universe, or last forever, to actually matter. It matters in the here and now, and it matters to actual, real people.
The religious people who ask this question of atheists, this, if it all ends, if it all amounts to nothing, then why does anything matter? That question is asked by those who don't understand the most basic truisms of storytelling, and thus the story of your life. That it's not the destination, but the journey that truly matters. Your life matters because you and others are currently alive. In the future, when human beings no longer exist, not only won't you matter, but there will be no reason for you to matter. This worrying about not mattering in 1,000 years is such a ridiculous thing to concern oneself with. You even concern yourself over the fact that movies in 2018 aren't being put on VHS tapes anymore? There's no reason for them to be, and that's okay. Maybe you won't matter in 1,000 years, and that will be okay too, because you're doing your mattering right now, while you can actually experience it. That's the beauty of mattering. They confuse not mattering with never having mattered. Don't let them get away with that.
Lennox talks about how Christianity is such a hope-filled philosophy, but is it really? And here's where I think we really need to talk about what I see as the greatest failure of this book. And that failure has to do with one single concept that is never once talked about in the book, even though it absolutely had to have been. And that is hell. The word hell is never mentioned once in the entire book, and it is only vaguely alluded to when Lennox starts talking about divine justice. And this is a massive problem because the entire point of the book is to address the claims made by atheists. And for the most part, Lennox does a pretty good job of touching on a wide range of, different angles to come at the issue from in each of his chapters, and I was consistently surprised by how many things I was convinced he wasn't going to talk about in the book, but he did. But the concept of hell and the way it is presented in Christianity is probably the most heavily criticized part of Christianity in the atheist community. There are so many atheists that talk all the time about the barbarity and immorality of hell.
I think the thing that actually did it for me was just taking the time and sitting down and thinking about the concept of hell. It is the most grotesque, insulting, mind-numbing, ridiculous concept that anybody could ever come up with. But there's this place, okay? If you don't follow a certain rule or pray a certain way to a certain God in a certain manner and say certain things that you go there forever, and you burn in pain and agony for eternity.
If Lennox really wanted to reach out to atheists with this book to try to change their minds, then he completely missed his opportunity to acknowledge probably their biggest gripe with Christianity. But I kind of wonder if that might have been intentional, because, how can you really justify the existence of hell being part of a perfectly just God's plan? I don't really think it's possible to do so. See, unless you're part of a fire and brimstone church like, the Westboro Baptist cult, most Christian teachings tend to focus less on hell and more on the eternal salvation that you have if you believe in Christ, because, people naturally take more kindly to that. And Lennox definitely echoes this attitude in his book. He only briefly touches on the atheist position that the afterlife is a horrible concept and answers by saying that it is much more satisfactory reality than, people dying in this life and never getting closure in the end. And he implies that people who dislike the concept of an afterlife simply don't want to be held accountable for their actions. However, the biggest mistake Lennox makes is automatically assuming that the final judgment is actually just. See, there are some Christians who don't actually profess a belief in hell, and others will simply try to argue that it's Satan who sends people to hell, but the Bible doesn't back them up on this. It's specifically stated in the New Testament that God created hell to punish Satan, and he would send anyone who did not accept the teachings of Jesus to burn there for eternity. I know in Christianity there are a lot of conflicting ideas about what kind of behavior is sufficient to have one wind up in hell, but the Bible states in quite a few passages that the acceptance of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior are necessary to enter the kingdom of heaven. And in theology class at Catholic school, I was taught that even if you're a good person, you still need to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. And even in Lennox's book, he strongly implies that the only way to truly gain salvation is through faith in God. I don't have faith in God, so according to Christianity, I'm going to hell if that doesn't change. Now let's consider for a second the fact that I might be completely wrong about what I believe. And Jesus really did die from the dead to save me from my sins. Is it just that I will burn forever because of that? No. Ignorance of any variety or magnitude, willful or not, is not a crime, and it is unjust to punish it. If Lennox happened to be wrong, I wouldn't say that it would be just to punish him forever. That's ridiculous. I mean, as ridiculous as the belief is, I wouldn't say that people who genuinely believe that the earth is actually flat deserve to be punished in any way. That doesn't make any sense. So here's my question to you, my aunt, and really think this over. Do you believe that if I died tomorrow believing what I believe, that I would be sentenced to be tortured forever in hell? Now, if so, do you actually think that's just? Wow, yeah, I know this just got kind of heavy for a book review, but in all seriousness, the topic of hell is probably enough to just fill up an entire video, and I probably will make one in the future, but, for now, I'm just going to try to wrap things up. Bring back things back to the actual topic of the book. As I said, I think that even though it's well written and does legitimately get its readers to think about things, I don't really think it would be all that successful in converting any outspoken atheist who reads it, and that's due to its complete failure to discuss and attempt to refute possibly the biggest problem many people have with Christianity. That's not to say I just liked the book, as I said before, I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I read it. Even though I disagreed with a lot of the conclusions drawn from it, the book was still very engaging and actually got me to think quite a bit about some stuff. And while it's, kind of fun to tear apart books like Theology of the Body for Beginners and Worry Less, Pray More, they're just, not very good. It's also incredibly important when trying to determine the truth to seek out and listen to rational and composed arguments from the other side. I would absolutely suggest that both Christians and especially atheists should, read this book and many others like it. Anyway, I'd just like to thank you, my aunt, for a really cool Christmas present. Just so you know, I definitely didn't talk about everything touched on in the book, and there was certainly a lot of stuff I left out for time reasons, and the book had a lot of content in it. It was over 200 pages. I would also just like to say that I have absolutely no problems with you sending me more of this stuff in the future to try to convert me back to Christianity. As a seeker of truth, I simply cannot contain myself to hearing arguments from only my own side, and I must seek out those people that I disagree with. But I also intend for this to be a bit of a two-way street, and if you continue sending me material attempting to change my mind, I will continue to create response videos to send to you. Anyway, in relation to that point, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also hope you will actually check out the other video I sent you called Is Atheism a Bankrupt Religion? Created by John Matter, who was one of the people I showed earlier in this video. The video isn't a response to the book I read, but it definitely deals with a lot of complaints about atheism expressed in Gunning for God in a pretty well-spoken way, though probably more harsh and aggressive than some of the ways that I tried to refute some of the arguments in this video. But, I think it's a really well-made and pointed video, and I don't know, I think it might be interesting for you to watch it. But but anyway, that is the end of the video, and I look forward to talking with you in the future, and